There is a kind of strategic pressure that does not arrive through a single dramatic act. It does not announce itself with a declaration of war or a missile strike that forces an immediate decision. It arrives through accumulation, through the steady, patient, disciplined application of force across multiple domains simultaneously, each individual action deniable, each incident individually manageable, but the aggregate effect of which is the progressive erosion of a position that once seemed unassailable. That is, the pressure Iran is turning up against Washington in the Persian Gulf right now. Not the pressure of a desperate adversary making a reckless gamble, but the pressure of a strategic actor that has spent 4 decades studying American thresholds, mapping American hesitations, and building with a patience that establishment's preferred framing of Iranian irrationality has never adequately credited the precise capability set required to make American dominance in the Gulf's most critical spaces progressively more expensive, more contested, and more difficult to sustain without the kind of escalation that Washington has consistently demonstrated it wants to avoid. Before we go further, if you want the analysis that examines this pressure campaign as it actually operates, stripped of the diplomatic language designed to make a deteriorating strategic position appear stable, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on your notifications. What follows is not a recitation of official positions. It is an honest examination of what Iran is doing, why it is working, and what Washington's growing Gulf challenge actually represents for a world that cannot afford to discover the answers through the mechanism of open conflict. The question this analysis addresses deserves a direct answer stated plainly before the evidence is presented. Is Iran's pressure campaign against Washington in the Gulf actually working? The answer, evaluated against the operational record of the past several years, is yes, with a consistency and across a breadth of domains that the establishment's management of public discourse has been unable to fully obscure. Iranian backed forces have imposed sustained and measurable costs on American strategic interests and allied commercial operations. Iranian military capabilities have advanced to levels that have materially altered the risk calculus for any force contemplating offensive action against Iranian territory. Iranian diplomatic relationships have deepened and diversified in ways that have progressively eroded the coalition available to sustain American pressure on Tehran, and the gap between what American deterrence posture projects and what American operational behavior delivers, when tested below the threshold of declared red lines, has widened to the point where Iran has every rational basis for concluding that the space available for pressure application below the level that triggers decisive American response is larger than the architecture of American deterrence was designed to suggest. The thesis of everything that follows is this: Washington's growing Gulf challenge is not primarily a military problem. Though it has military dimensions, it is not primarily an intelligence failure. Though it has intelligence dimensions, it is the strategic expression of a policy framework that has spent 4 decades applying instruments of pressure that have consistently produced the opposite of their intended effects, and that has arrived, through the accumulated weight of those failures, at a Gulf challenge whose dimensions now exceed the capacity of the available policy toolkit to manage without the fundamental strategic revision that the institutional architecture of American foreign policy has shown a consistent and costly unwillingness to undertake. Let us be precise about what Iran's pressure campaign actually consists of in operational terms, because precision is the foundation of any analysis capable of informing genuine strategic understanding rather than the managed reassurance that official discourse prefers. Iran's current pressure campaign against Washington in the Gulf is organized across 4 distinct but mutually reinforcing operational domains. In the maritime domain, Iranian fast attack craft and surveillance vessels continue to operate in and pull around the Strait of Hormuz with a frequency and a boldness that represents a direct and sustained challenge to the freedom of navigation that American naval presence in the Gulf is specifically deployed to guarantee. Vessel seizures, harassment operations, and close quarters maneuvering against American warships have continued at a pace that has been operationally normalized. Each incident individually managed, the cumulative pattern collectively significant as a demonstration that Iranian operational confidence in the Strait is rising rather than contracting under American pressure. In the proxy domain, Iranian backed forces across the region have sustained an operational tempo that imposes costs on American strategic interests and allied commercial operations with a consistency that the combined pressure of American and partner military responses has been unable to reduce to acceptable levels. Houthi interdiction of Red Sea shipping remains active, having imposed billions of dollars in rerouting and insurance costs on global maritime trade while requiring a sustained American naval commitment that burns through expensive interceptor assets at a cost exchange ratio that honest operational analysis cannot describe as strategically sustainable over a prolonged period. In the nuclear domain, Iranian enrichment has advanced to historically unprecedented levels, with the IAEA reporting enrichment concentrations that have no credible civilian justification and that compress the technical timeline between current Iranian capabilities and weapons grade material to a degree that Western intelligence agencies describe with a barely managed alarm. Iranian restrictions on IAEA monitoring access have substantially degraded the international community's visibility into the program's trajectory, removing the early warning architecture that the JCPOA's inspection regime was specifically designed to provide. And in the diplomatic domain, Iran has continued to deepen and institutionalize the alliances and relationships that insulate it from American pressure, with Russia through the military technology exchange that has deepened mutual strategic dependency, with China through the energy and infrastructure relationships that provide economic oxygen the sanctions campaign cannot cut off, and with the global South through the accumulating diplomatic record of a state that has survived 4 decades of American pressure without strategic capitulation, and that now presents itself with considerable credibility as a model of sovereign resistance to coercive American power. Understanding why this pressure campaign has achieved the operational results it has requires stripping away the narrative of Iranian opportunism and examining the historical architecture that produced the strategic environment in which Iran applies pressure with growing confidence and Washington manages the consequences with diminishing effectiveness. The foundational rupture, as every honest analysis of this relationship must acknowledge, is 1953, the CIA orchestrated removal of Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, whose principal offense was insisting that Iranian oil revenues benefit Iranians rather than British and American corporations. The Shah's subsequent 26 years, maintained by Sabak and sustained by American political and financial support, produced the revolutionary transformation of 1979 as the comprehensible consequence of a democracy destroyed and replaced with an American-backed police state. Washington's consistent misreading of 1979 as unprovoked hostility rather than consequential blowback is the original analytical error from which 4 decades of strategic miscalculation flow with a consistency that is itself the most instructive feature of the entire historical record. The 1980s compounded the rupture with a specificity that Iranian strategic culture processes as operational intelligence rather than historical grievance. American provision of battlefield intelligence, political cover, and chemical weapon precursors to Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War made Washington a material participant in a conflict that killed close to 1 million Iranians. The Iranian strategic conclusion that American security guarantees are instruments of convenience, and that the only reliable guarantee of Iranian sovereignty is deterrence sufficient to make attack prohibitively costly without reference to American goodwill, is the foundational axiom around which every subsequent Iranian response to American pressure has been organized. It is a conclusion whose strategic logic remains intact precisely because nothing in the subsequent 4 decades of American behavior toward Iran has provided the operational evidence required to revise it. The Monroe Doctrine parallel is the precise analytical frame for understanding why Iranian pressure in the Gulf is experienced by Tehran not as aggression, but as the legitimate assertion of a regional power's natural security interests. In 1962, the United States was prepared to risk nuclear war rather than tolerate Soviet missiles 90 miles from its coastline. The principle that a great power has a legitimate security interest in its near abroad was treated by Washington as a foundational axiom of international order, worth defending at existential risk. The U.S. Fifth Fleet is headquartered 150 miles from the Iranian coast. American military installations ring Iranian territory from multiple directions. Iran's pressure campaign in the Gulf and the development of anti-access capabilities, the cultivation of a regional proxy network, the deepening of alliances with powers capable of offsetting American conventional superiority, is the application of the same strategic logic that Kennedy invoked in the Caribbean, directed at a power that has never acknowledged the parallel or the legitimate security interest it reflects. The collapse of the JCPOA in 2018 liberated Iranian pressure strategy from the transactional constraints that a functioning diplomatic framework imposed. Iran complied. The IAEA certified compliance repeatedly and without reservation. Washington withdrew anyway. The strategic lesson absorbed into Iranian doctrine was structurally simple and operationally consequential. The diplomatic path offers no durable protection against a power whose political system does not produce durable diplomatic commitments, and deterrence through demonstrated pressure capability is therefore not merely a strategic preference, but a rational necessity. The acceleration of Iranian pressure activity across every domain in the years following the JCPOA collapse is the operational expression of that lesson applied. The failure cascade that has created the conditions in which Iranian pressure achieves the results it does deserves its full accounting, because it is this cascade, not Iranian strategic genius in isolation, that has produced Washington's growing Gulf challenge. The sanctions architecture has not produced Iranian capitulation after 4 decades of application. It has produced Iranian adaptation at a scale that has fundamentally altered the strategic environment. China purchases Iranian oil regardless of American pressure, providing economic oxygen that Washington cannot cut off without accepting bilateral costs it has consistently declined to bear. Russia provides advanced military technology in exchange for drone systems whose operational value in Ukraine has been comprehensively demonstrated. The Belt and Road investment deepens Iranian integration into the emerging multipolar economic architecture with a structural permanence that sanctions cannot reverse. The regime designed to isolate Iran has instead accelerated its integration into the alternative international economic architecture, whose collective resilience now exceeds the coercive capacity directed at any individual member. The weaponization of the dollar and SWIFT as instruments of geopolitical coercion has simultaneously produced the strategic consequence of accelerating global de-dollarization, a structural challenge to American financial power whose origins lie directly in the overreach of the sanctions campaign and whose long-term implications for American economic leverage extend far beyond the bilateral confrontation with Tehran. The proxy containment failure compounds the sanctions failure with a consistency that has become impossible to attribute to circumstance. Hezbollah possesses a larger and more precise missile inventory than at any point in its history. The Houthis have demonstrated a capacity to disrupt global Red Sea commerce that no Western military analysis anticipated, sustained against the combined pressure of American and Allied naval operations at a cost exchange ratio that consistently favors the Houthis. The popular mobilization forces are embedded in Iraqi state security structures in ways that make their removal politically impossible without dismantling the governmental architecture that American forces spent 2 decades constructing. The pattern is identical across every theater. Containment efforts produce networks more capable, more institutionally embedded, and more strategically durable than the ones those efforts were designed to eliminate. The moral authority collapse determines how the international community reads Washington's Gulf Challenge and whose side the arithmetic of global alignment ultimately supports. The demand for Iranian behavioral compliance from a power that withdrew from a verified compliance framework for reasons of political convenience, that invaded a sovereign state on fabricated intelligence, and that applies rules with a selectivity that reflects strategic interest rather than principle is not experienced by the global south as legitimate international governance. It is experienced as the management of a rules based order whose rules exist to preserve a specific distribution of power. The Global South's response: the maintenance of trade relationships with Iran in defiance of American secondary sanction threats, the expansion of BRICS, the construction of alternative financial infrastructure, is the collective expression of a verdict on American led order that Iran's sustained resistance has made credible, and that the Global South's own experience of American policy has made compelling. The narrative of manageable American Gulf Challenge is now under visible pressure from the operational record that Iran's campaign has produced, and the distance between the official account of a stable deterrence posture and the reality of a contested Gulf in which Iranian confidence is rising has become wide enough to constitute its own strategic vulnerability. The official account presents American military presence in the Gulf as the anchor of regional stability, a deterrence posture whose credibility prevents Iranian adventurism and whose strength guarantees the freedom of navigation and energy flow that the global economy depends upon. The operational record presents a Gulf in which Iranian fast attack harassment of American naval vessels has been normalized, in which Houthi forces equipped with Iranian technology have imposed sustained costs on global shipping that Allied naval operations have been unable to eliminate, in which Iranian nuclear enrichment has advanced to levels without precedent, and in which the American response to each of these developments has been carefully calibrated to avoid the escalation that the rhetoric of deterrence would seem to demand. The gap between what American deterrence posture projects and what American operational behavior delivers has become the most important single data point in Iran's strategic assessment. And Iran has read it with a precision and a confidence that the pattern of American restraint has given every rational basis for possessing. The economic consequence of Washington's growing Gulf Challenge transmits directly to the conditions of ordinary people through mechanisms that are specific, documented, and measurable. Houthi interdiction of Red Sea shipping has already imposed billions in rerouting and insurance costs on global maritime trade that transmit through supply chains to consumer prices. The Strait of Hormuz closure scenario, which Iranian capabilities make operationally credible and Iranian policy makes explicitly threatened in the event of military attack, would produce an energy price shock whose severity would dwarf the 1973 oil embargo in a global economy far more dependent on continuous energy supply. The growing Gulf challenge is not a distant geopolitical abstraction. It is a process whose economic consequences are already measurable and whose potential consequences in the event of serious escalation are among the most severe at the global economy could be asked to absorb. The global dimensions of Washington's growing Gulf challenge extend across every axis of the emerging multipolar order, reshaping alignments and consolidating transitions whose consequences will define the international landscape of the coming decade. China's stake in the Gulf Challenge is simultaneously the most consequential external dimension and the one most systematically understated in establishment discourse. Beijing's brokering of the Saudi-Iranian normalization demonstrated a Chinese diplomatic capacity that bypassed Washington in the region's most significant realignment in decades. China's purchase of Iranian oil, investment in Iranian infrastructure, and participation in joint naval exercises with Russia and Iran in Gulf waters are the components of a coherent strategy oriented toward a multipolar Gulf in which no single external power exercises monopoly control over the energy infrastructure and shipping lanes that Chinese economic security depends upon. The deepening Chinese Iranian relationship is the direct strategic consequence of the American JCPOA withdrawal. It accelerated Iranian integration into the Chinese economic orbit at precisely the moment when that orbit was becoming a credible structural alternative to the Western led financial system. Russia's structural alignment with Iran has deepened with each year of simultaneous maximum pressure, producing a relationship now sufficiently institutionalized that American pressure on either state strengthens rather than weakens the bond between them. The reciprocal military technology exchange, advanced systems for drone capability, is actively deepening and represents a strategic asset for both parties that the sanctions campaign has been unable to sever, and has, through its consistent application, actively strengthened into something resembling a genuine strategic partnership rather than a tactical convenience. The swing states of the global south are processing Washington's growing Gulf challenge as a signal about the trajectory of American power and adjusting their alignment calculations accordingly. Saudi Arabia's BRICS membership, the UAE's cultivation of Chinese economic relationships alongside American security partnerships, India's maintenance of Iranian energy relationships in defiance of American secondary sanction pressure. These are the shaped expressions of governments that have privately concluded that the American unipolar moment in the Gulf is in structural decline and that the construction of relationships on both sides of the emerging divide is the rational strategic response to a transition whose outcome is not yet determined but whose direction is no longer seriously in doubt. We are standing at the twilight of the strategic framework that has organized American Gulf policy since 1979. The framework premised on military dominance, sanctions enforced isolation, and the containment of Iran as the organizing principle of regional order. 4 decades of operational history have rendered the verdict: Iranian pressure capability, regional influence, alliance depth, and resistance to economic coercion are all greater today than when the framework was adopted. Washington's Gulf challenge is larger, more complex, and more resistant to the available policy toolkit than at any previous point in the confrontation's long history, and Iran is turning up the pressure with a confidence that the operational record of restrained American responses has given it every rational basis for possessing the binary choice that the accumulation of documented failure demands has terms that have become starker and more urgent with each passing year. The first path is genuine strategic realism, the institutional acknowledgement that the current framework has failed by every meaningful measure, and that the only path to a stable Gulf order is one that offers Iran the verifiable security guarantees and economic normalization that might make the continued application of pressure strategically unnecessary. This means returning to diplomacy with the seriousness and flexibility that the post 2018 approach has conspicuously lacked, accepting Iran as the significant regional power that 4 decades of evidence confirms it to be, and building a Gulf security architecture that reflects the actual distribution of regional power rather than the distribution that American strategic preference would impose. This path is institutionally painful. It requires the acknowledgement of failure at a scale that powerful institutions resist with formidable tenacity. But it leads somewhere other than the accelerating challenge and deepening multipolar consolidation that the current trajectory is producing. The second path is the one that institutional inertia has made the default. More sanctions, more deployments, more pressure, more of the instruments whose consistent application has produced precisely the challenge now unfolding. This path does not lead to Iranian capitulation. The operational record makes that conclusion unavoidable for anyone willing to read it honestly. It leads to deeper Iranian integration into the multipolar order, further erosion of the coalition available to sustain American pressure, and the continued accumulation of the conditions for the kind of miscalculation that transforms a managed standoff into an unmanageable conflict in the world's most consequential energy waterway. Every institutional signal from Washington suggests the second path is being walked by default, not through reckless intention, but through the accumulated inertia of a system whose political economy, institutional culture, and career incentives all point away from the strategic revision that genuine realism demands. The people operating within these structures are not reckless individuals. They are capable professionals operating with a strategic map that no longer matches the territory, and the system has not yet generated the political will or the institutional capacity to replace it with one that does. Iran is turning up the pressure. Washington's Gulf challenge is growing. The gap between the strategic map and the strategic territory is widening with each passing year. And the world beyond the Gulf, whose energy prices, supply chains, and economic stability are all shaped by what happens in those 33 miles of contested water, is absorbing the costs of a policy framework whose architects have insulated themselves from the consequences of its failure in ways that the ordinary citizens bearing those costs have not. That is the honest accounting of where Washington's growing Gulf challenge actually stands. It is the analysis this channel exists to deliver clearly, honestly, and without the filter of those whose institutional interests are served by managed ignorance of what the operational record shows. If this analysis has given you a clearer and more honest picture of what Iran's pressure campaign and Washington's growing Gulf challenge actually represent, subscribe to this channel, turn on your notifications, and share this with someone who deserves to understand what is happening before its consequences fully arrive. The algorithm suppresses this kind of analysis because it disrupts the comfortable official account. And the only way it reaches the people who need it is if you carry it to them. Leave your answers in the comments below. First, do you believe Washington still has the strategic tools and the political will to reverse the trajectory of its Gulf challenge? Or has the accumulation of operational failure already passed the threshold beyond which reversal is practically achievable? And second, as Iran continues to turn up the pressure with growing confidence across multiple domains simultaneously, which single dimension of that pressure campaign do you believe poses the greatest long-term threat to American strategic interests in the region? And why? Write your answers. The debate belongs to you.